The blade stopped a hand's breadth from the child's throat. My arm trembled with the effort of holding it there, suspended between command and conscience, between the vow of obedience I had sworn 20 years ago, and something deeper that had no name but screamed inside my chest with a voice I could not silence. The boy looked up at me with eyes that held no fear, only a terrible understanding, as though he already knew what men were capable of, what holy warriors did in the name of God and duty. Behind me, Brother Commander Reynald's voice cut through the hot Syrian air like the crack of a whip. "Kill the Saracen spawn, Brother Thomas. That is an order. We leave no witnesses, no survivors who might carry word of our position to Saladin's forces." My hand tightened on the sword's grip. The boy did not move, did not beg, did not pray. He simply waited. And in his waiting, I saw something that shattered every certainty I had built my life upon. I saw myself, not as I believed I was, but as I truly appeared to this child, to God, to the judgment that awaited all of us beyond this world of blood and righteousness and expedient murder. I had joined the order at 17, the third son of a minor Norman lord with no inheritance and no prospects beyond the church or the sword. The temple offered both, a chance to serve God while still carrying weapons, to find purpose in the defense of pilgrims and the Holy Land, to transform the violence that came naturally to young men into something sanctified, something meaningful. I took my vows in the chapel at La Rochelle on a spring morning, kneeling before the Master as he laid the white mantle across my shoulders and spoke the words that would bind me for life: poverty, chastity, obedience, eternal service to the order and to Christ. I believed every word. I believed that God had called me to this life, that the sword I carried was His instrument, that the enemies I would face were His enemies, and that in fighting them I would earn salvation for myself and protection for the innocent pilgrims who journeyed to Jerusalem. It was a simple faith, built on certainties that seemed as solid as the stone walls of our fortresses, as unquestionable as the rising of the sun. I arrived in Outremer 6 months after taking my vows, sailing from Marseille with 30 other young knights, all of us burning with zeal, all of us eager to prove ourselves in the holy war that had consumed this land for nearly a century. The reality of that war struck me like a physical blow the moment I stepped off the ship in Acre. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with smells I could not identify, spices and excrement and something else, something like despair made manifest in the very atmosphere. The city was crowded beyond anything I had experienced in France, streets packed with people of every description, Franks and Greeks, Armenians and Arabs, Christians and Jews and Muslims all jostling together in a chaos that seemed to mock every story I had heard about the clear divisions between Crusader and infidel. I was assigned to the garrison at Chastelblanc, a fortress in the mountains north of Tripoli, and I spent my first 5 years learning what it meant to be a Templar knight in a land where faith was tested daily by the grinding reality of endless conflict. The warfare in Outremer was not what I had imagined. There were few great battles, few moments of clear triumph where righteousness prevailed and God's will was made manifest. Instead, there was a constant low-level brutality, raids and counter-raids, ambushes on the roads, skirmishes over wells and grazing lands, the slow attrition of men and resources in a conflict that seemed to have no resolution, only temporary pauses before the violence resumed. I learned to kill efficiently, learned to recognize the sound of an arrow in flight, learned which wounds were mortal and which could be survived if treated quickly. I watched brothers die from infected cuts, from fever, from arrows fired by enemies we never saw. I participated in raids on Saracen villages, burning homes and taking prisoners, telling myself this was necessary to weaken the enemy, to protect Christian holdings, to fulfill the mission the order had given me. And slowly, imperceptibly, the simple faith I had brought from France began to erode, worn away by experiences that did not fit the stories I had been told, by questions that had no easy answers. Brother Commander Reynald arrived at Chastelblanc in my 6th year of service, a veteran of 30 years in the Holy Land, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his reputation for effectiveness. He took command of our garrison with absolute authority, transforming our operations from defensive patrols to aggressive raids deep into Saracen territory. Under his leadership, we struck at villages and caravans, taking plunder to fund our operations, taking prisoners to ransom or exchange. Reynald justified every action with appeals to military necessity, to the greater good of the Christian presence in Outremer, to the harsh realities of war that required harsh measures. "We are not here to be loved," he told us during one of his frequent addresses to the assembled knights. "We are here to be feared. Fear keeps the Saracens from our borders. Fear protects the pilgrims who depend on our strength. Show mercy, and you show weakness, and weakness invites attack. This is the calculus of survival in this land. Accept it or return to France, and let men with stronger stomachs do what must be done." I accepted it because I had sworn obedience, because questioning my commander's orders was not merely discouraged but forbidden, because the alternative was to admit that perhaps the order's methods were not as righteous as I had believed, and that admission would have undermined everything I had built my life upon. I participated in Reynald's raids without protest, without allowing myself to examine too closely what we were doing, what it meant to burn homes and take prisoners and kill those who resisted. I told myself that war was cruel by nature, that the enemy would do the same to us given the chance, that my doubts were simply weakness, a failure of faith that I needed to overcome through prayer and discipline and stricter adherence to my vows. For 3 years I lived this way, performing my duties with mechanical efficiency, praying the hours without feeling the prayers, existing in a state of careful numbness that protected me from questions I did not want to answer. And then came the raid on the village where I found the boy, and everything I had been avoiding forced itself upon me in a single moment of decision. We had struck at dawn, a small village in the hills east of our fortress, a place Reynald claimed was providing supplies to Saladin's forces. The resistance was minimal, a few men with old weapons, quickly overwhelmed by armored knights on horseback. We took the village in less than an hour, gathered the survivors in the central square, began the process of separating those who might be ransomed from those who were simply in the way. That was when I found the boy hiding in one of the houses, a child of perhaps 8 years clutching a wooden toy sword as though it might protect him from the armed men who had just destroyed his world. I pulled him from his hiding place and brought him to the square where Reynald was interrogating prisoners, asking which of them knew the location of Saracen forces in the area, offering life to those who would betray their own people. The boy's father was there, I learned later, a man who refused to speak even when threatened, even when his silence meant death for himself and his family. Reynald ordered me to execute the child in front of his father, to break the man's will, to extract the information we needed. "Kill the boy," he said, his voice flat and certain. "Do it quickly, Brother Thomas. We have no time to waste on sentiment." I drew my sword because that was what a Templar knight did when given an order by his commander. I placed the blade against the child's throat because obedience was absolute, because questioning orders was forbidden, because everything I had been taught for 20 years told me that my duty was clear, and my hesitation was sin. But as I stood there with the boy's life in my hands, as I looked into his eyes and saw not an enemy, but simply a child who wanted to live, who had done nothing to deserve this fate except be born to the wrong father in the wrong village in the wrong place, I felt something break inside me. Not my faith exactly. I still believed in God, still believed in Christ, still believed that somewhere beyond this blood-soaked world, there was truth and justice and meaning. But my faith in the order, my faith in the righteousness of our mission, my faith in the idea that obedience to earthly commanders was the same as obedience to God, all of that shattered in an instant of terrible clarity. I could not kill this child. I would not kill this child. Whatever the cost of that refusal, whatever punishment awaited me, I had found the limit of my obedience, the line I could not cross no matter what vows I had sworn. I lowered my sword and stepped back from the boy, turned to face Reynald with my heart pounding and my mouth dry. "No," I said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. "I will not kill him. He is a child, unarmed, no threat to anyone. This is murder, not war. This is not what I swore to do when I took my vows." The silence that followed my refusal was absolute, terrible in its weight. Every knight in that square was watching now, waiting to see what Reynald would do, how he would respond to this unprecedented defiance. His face went red, then white, then settled into an expression of cold fury. "You refuse a direct order?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "You, who swore obedience before God and the Master, who promised to submit your will to the will of your commanders, you dare to refuse?" I met his eyes and I did not look away. "I swore to serve God," I said. "I swore to defend pilgrims and uphold the honor of the order. I did not swear to murder children. If you believe this order comes from God, if you believe this is what Christ would command, then you are mistaken, and I will not participate in your mistake, no matter what the cost." Reynald's hand moved to his sword, and for a moment I thought he would strike me down there in the square, would execute me for disobedience and use my death as an example to the other knights. But he was too clever for that, too aware of the watching brothers, too conscious that killing one of our own over the life of a Saracen child might raise questions he did not want asked. Instead, he ordered me arrested, had 2 sergeants seize my arms and strip me of my weapons. "You will be taken to Acre," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You will face a tribunal for disobedience and breaking of your vows. You will be expelled from the order at minimum, possibly executed depending on the judgment of the Grand Master. Take him away." As they dragged me from the square, as they threw me across a horse and began the long journey south to Acre, I looked back and saw the boy still standing there, alive because of my refusal, because I had finally found the courage to say no when yes would have been easier. I did not know if I had done the right thing. I only knew I could not have done otherwise and remained myself, remained the person I had believed I was before faith became confused with obedience and righteousness, became indistinguishable from murder. The journey to Acre took 5 days. 5 days in which I had nothing to do but think about what I had done, about the consequences that awaited me, about whether my refusal had been courage or cowardice, faithfulness or betrayal. The sergeants who guarded me were not unkind, though they did not speak to me except to give necessary commands. I sensed that they were uncertain about what had happened, troubled perhaps by Reynald's order, by my refusal, by the questions my disobedience raised about the nature of their own service. On the 3rd night, as we camped in the ruins of an old fortress, one of them approached me where I sat in chains and offered me water. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly. "You must have known what would happen, what it would cost you. Why refuse over the life of one Saracen child?" I thought about his question for a long time before answering. "Because I realized that my vows mean nothing if they can be used to justify anything," I finally said. "I swore to serve God, to defend the innocent, to uphold justice and mercy. If those vows can be set aside whenever my commander orders me to kill a child, then they are not vows at all. Just empty words I spoke to make myself feel righteous while doing whatever I am told. I refused because I had to know whether my faith was real or just obedience dressed in holy language." We reached Acre on the 6th day, and I was taken immediately to the temple fortress where the Grand Master kept his residence. The tribunal convened the next morning in the chapter house, a gathering of senior knights tasked with judging whether my disobedience warranted expulsion or death. Brother Commander Reynald testified first, describing my refusal in terms that made it sound like madness, like a failure of nerve, like corruption by enemy sympathies. He painted me as unreliable, as someone whose commitment to the order was suspect, whose willingness to follow orders could not be trusted. Other brothers testified to my years of faithful service, to my courage in battle, to the fact that I had never before shown any sign of disobedience or doubt. And then I was called to speak in my own defense, to explain why I had refused an order, what could possibly justify such a breach of my vows. I stood before the assembled knights and I told them the truth. I refused because the order was wrong, not tactically wrong, not merely unwise, but morally wrong in a way that violated everything I believed about God and justice and the purpose of our order. We are called to defend pilgrims, to protect the innocent, to be the sword of righteousness in this troubled land. We are not called to murder children to extract information, to become the very thing we claim to oppose. I understand that war is cruel, that difficult decisions must be made, that sometimes innocents suffer despite our best intentions. But there is a difference between the unavoidable tragedies of war and the deliberate choice to kill a defenseless child. I chose to draw that line, to say that some orders cannot be followed no matter who gives them, and I would make the same choice again, even knowing it would cost me everything. The Grand Master, an old warrior named Odo who had served in Outremer for 40 years, listened to my testimony with an expression I could not read. When I finished, he dismissed the tribunal and told me to wait while they deliberated. I sat alone in a small cell for 6 hours praying, thinking, preparing myself for whatever judgment would come. When they finally called me back to the chapter house, I expected to hear my sentence of expulsion, perhaps even of death if Reynald had argued persuasively enough for the severity of my crime. Instead, the Grand Master spoke words I had not anticipated. "Brother Thomas, you have been found guilty of disobedience to your commander, a serious offense that normally carries severe punishment. However, after hearing your testimony and examining the circumstances of your refusal, this tribunal has concluded that the order you disobeyed was itself a violation of the principles of our order. Brother Commander Reynald exceeded his authority in ordering the execution of a child for purely tactical purposes, and your refusal, while technically disobedient, was morally justified. You will not be expelled. You will not be punished. Instead, you will be reassigned to a different garrison under a different commander, and you will serve out your remaining years in the order, with the understanding that obedience has limits, that even holy warriors must answer to a higher law than the commands of their superiors." I could not speak. I had prepared myself for exile or death, had made my peace with losing everything, and now I was being told not only that I would keep my place in the order, but that my refusal had been right, that the tribunal saw what I had seen, that obedience was not absolute when it demanded the abandonment of conscience. The Grand Master continued, "You have reminded us of something we had perhaps forgotten in the grinding brutality of this war, that we are not merely soldiers but knights, not merely warriors but servants of a God who commands us to protect the weak, to show mercy to the helpless, to be more than just efficient killers. Your refusal was an act of faith, Brother Thomas, not faith in the order or in your commanders, but faith in the God we all claim to serve. That kind of faith is rare and precious, and we cannot afford to punish it even when it costs us tactical advantage or makes our operations more complicated. Go with our blessing, and know that you have done the order a service by forcing us to examine ourselves, to remember who we are meant to be." They sent me to a small fortress on the coast, a quiet posting where my duties consisted mainly of escorting pilgrims on the final leg of their journey to Jerusalem, of providing protection without engaging in the kind of aggressive raiding that Reynald had favored. It was peaceful work, meaningful work, and I discovered that my faith, which had been so shaken by my years under Reynald's command, began to heal in this new environment. I prayed again with genuine feeling rather than mechanical routine. I spoke with pilgrims about their reasons for making this dangerous journey, about the faith that drove them to risk everything to walk in the footsteps of Christ. I trained younger knights, teaching them not just how to fight but why we fought, what principles should guide a warrior who claims to serve God. And I thought often about the boy I had refused to kill, wondered what had become of him, whether he had survived the raid, whether he would grow up hating all Christians for what we had done to his village, or whether he might understand that not all of us were the same, that some of us at least tried to be more than our worst actions. 5 years after the tribunal, I received word that Brother Commander Reynald had been killed in a raid that went badly, that he had died fighting, that his body had been recovered and buried with honor in the cemetery at Chastelblanc. I felt nothing at the news, no satisfaction, no grief, just a kind of hollow recognition that the man who had ordered me to kill a child was himself dead now, would face whatever judgment awaited all of us beyond this life. I prayed for his soul because that was what we did for fallen brothers, but my prayers felt empty, words spoken from duty rather than conviction. I could not forgive him for what he had tried to make me do, could not reconcile the idea that we had served the same order, sworn the same vows, claimed allegiance to the same God. Perhaps he had believed he was doing right. Perhaps he had convinced himself that harsh measures were necessary. that the end justified the means, or perhaps he had simply stopped questioning years ago, had surrendered his conscience to obedience so completely that he no longer recognized the difference between service and sin. I would never know. All I knew was that his death changed nothing, that the questions his orders had forced me to confront remained unanswered, that faith was not a simple thing but a constant wrestling with doubt and certainty, with obedience and conscience, with the gap between what we believed and what we did. I'm an old man now, past 60, my fighting days long behind me. I spend my time in the scriptorium of our fortress, recording the deeds of brothers who have served and died, preserving stories that might otherwise be lost. I write of battles won and lost, of fortresses taken and abandoned, of the slow grinding erosion of Christian power in this land that has consumed so many lives. But I also write of smaller things, of kindnesses shown to enemies, of mercy extended when vengeance would have been easier, of moments when faith meant choosing right over expedient, conscience over command. I write about the boy I refused to kill, about the choice that defined the rest of my life, about what I learned in that moment when I discovered that obedience has limits and faith demands more than just following orders. Some who read these words will think I was right to refuse, that I upheld the honor of the order by refusing to participate in murder. Others will think I was wrong, that I let sentiment override duty, that my disobedience weakened discipline and set a dangerous precedent. I cannot say which view is correct. I can only say that I made the choice I had to make, that I could not have done otherwise and remained myself, and that I have spent the rest of my life trying to understand what it means to serve God when service demands more than blind obedience, when faith requires us to think and question and sometimes stand alone against the tide of certainty that sweeps others along. The crisis I faced was not about whether God existed or whether Christ had risen, or whether the faith I had been taught was true in some abstract sense. It was about what that faith demanded of me in a specific moment, what it meant to claim devotion to a God of mercy while standing with a sword at a child's throat. I discovered that day that faith is not a static thing, not a set of propositions we accept and then never question, but a living relationship that must be constantly renewed, constantly tested, constantly refined by the hard work of applying principles to circumstances that do not fit neatly into the categories we have been given. Devotion, I learned, is not the same as obedience. Devotion requires discernment, requires wisdom, requires the courage to say no when yes would be easier, but wrong. I redefined my understanding of what it meant to serve God that day, moved from a faith built on certainty and simple obedience to a faith built on conscience and moral courage and the willingness to stand alone when necessary. It was a harder faith, a more demanding faith, a faith that gave me less comfort and more responsibility. But it was also a truer faith, more honest about the complexities of living righteously in a world that does not offer simple choices, more realistic about what God asks of those who claim to serve Him. I think often about the other nights in that village square, the ones who watched me refuse Reynald's order, who saw me arrested and taken away. Some must have thought I was a fool, throwing away my position in the order over the life of one enemy child. Others perhaps felt relief that someone had finally said no, that the line had been drawn even if they lacked the courage to draw it themselves. I hope some of them learned from what I did. Hope they questioned their own obedience, examined their own faith, asked themselves whether the orders they followed were truly righteous or simply expedient. But I cannot know what effect my refusal had on them, cannot measure whether my stand made any difference beyond saving one child's life. Perhaps it made no difference at all. Perhaps I am simply a footnote in the history of the order, a minor scandal quickly forgotten, a moment of disobedience that changed nothing except my own understanding of faith. But I believe, I must believe, that small acts of conscience matter, that refusing to participate in evil is its own justification, that faith lived honestly is worth more than expedience pursued efficiently. The boy I refused to kill lived because I said no. That has to matter. That has to mean something, even if its meaning is known only to God and to the child who grew up because a Templar knight found the courage to disobey. Non nobis, Domine. Not unto us, O Lord, but to thy name give glory. These words meant one thing when I first swore my vows, meant something different after my crisis of faith, mean something else again now in the twilight of my life. They remind me that service is not about our glory or our certainty or our comfort, but about striving imperfectly toward a perfection we will never achieve in this life. I faced my crisis, and I redefined my devotion. That is my legacy, small though it may be. The knowledge that faith demands more than obedience, that serving God means sometimes standing alone, that the truest devotion is found not in certainty, but in the courage to question, to doubt, to choose right, even when the cost is everything we have.